Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank UNAULA and particularly Salim, and who I know who's no longer at UNAULA, but Salim and Alexa, who can't be with us today. But there's Leonardo and other tech people. Sandra, our translator interpreter, is here as well. I'd like to thank them as collaborators on these pre-conference events, as well as the conference, which will take place in July 2022. So as I said before, this is the fourth webinar in a series of pre-conference events. There were three prior to this. We've had one on sort of an introductory sort of panel on development in times of conflict. A second one was on global vaccine justice. And the last one, which happened a month ago, was on ethics and development in sort of peace and conflict, very particular to Medellin, which was wonderful because it was the presenters were all from Medellin and very much on the ground, workers and thinkers as well. So this one follows in a sense where it's not meant to be sort of more academic or mere theoretical, although it might seem like that. But the idea is to now sort of bring in I think the overarching conference theme, development ethics in the time of conflict, right? So that's what we'll be talking about today. And if you are interested in seeing previous webinars, which I do recommend you do, they're all available, they're all public on our website. I've put the link to our website in the chat box. And on that website, you'll also see the CVP, the call for abstracts, call for papers for our conference. We're still in the process of fine-tuning the relaunching of the second CVP. So bear with us. And the conference was supposed to take place in 2020. We had to postpone it, sort of a number of times, but we are aiming for it to take place in a hybrid format in July 2022. So more details about that will, be available in the next few days. So I don't want to spend too much time sort of talking and taking away the space and time of our presenters. So we have three speakers with us today. So first of all, I'm going to present, and the order, how we're going to do it. We're going to start with Dave Crocker. We're going to then follow with Luis Camacho, and then finish with Eduardo Rueda. So let me tell you a little bit about Dave, right? So Dave is a professor emeritus at the University of Maryland. He specializes in international development ethics, social political philosophy, and transitional justice, as well as democracy and democratizing action. He is the founder and former president of IDEA, which is the International Development Ethics Association, one of the conference organizers. And he's also currently on the board of the Center for Values in International Development, which is a relatively new nonprofit organization aimed at promoting ethical values in international development, and founded by Chloe Schwenke, who is a former student of David. A book dedicated to David's work titled Agency and Democracy in Development Ethics was edited by two of his former students, Stacey Cosco and Laurie Callahan. So it's interesting seeing the legacy, not only the wonderful work of David, but also his legacy, how it's just continued on and how it's so prominent in the development ethics field today. So without further ado, let's go on and listen to Dave. So we're going to give Dave 15 minutes to speak. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's wonderful to be part of this, as you asked me to speak a little bit about the emergence of IDEA and its founding. And I'd be glad to do that as I look back over 37 years since we met for the first time in San Jose, Costa Rica in 1984. And it was part of a symposium that I organized as part of the 8th World Conference on Future Studies. And the symposium I organized with only 13 of us participating at first was called Ethical Issues in International Development. I'd been teaching a course at Colorado State University for several years on ethics and development. And this was the first time that we brought together some people that were interested in this topic, and it was in the context of Costa Rica. What was interesting is that I had invited 13 people to come. Prominent among them was Mihailo Markovic, at that time someone I was working with and working on. To make a long story short, the relationship changed radically many years later when he became an apologist for the Milosevic, the dictator in Yugoslavia. But at this point, we were working together, and he was part of this World Conference on Future Studies. The 13 of us from the outside arrived, including Odera Oruko from Kenya, Yugoslav economist, and another couple of people with international experience that were working on issues in relation to international development. We came to the initial meeting where we thought we were going to make a presentation, and lo and behold, on the stage were already philosophers from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Costa Rica, and they were usurping our place. We were supposed to be on the stage. Little did we know that they would become not only colleagues, but lifelong friends as we worked together to move beyond a working group in development ethics to the International Development Ethics Association, which we always pronounced as IDEA, since it was really founded in Costa Rica and had a Costa Rican dimension all the way through. One interesting aspect of that meeting was not only the international participation of people dealing with ethics and development, although most of us were from the United States, but we did have representatives from other parts of the world, but also a site visit to the Costa Rican town of Turrialba, in which there was a research station. And we met with people in the research station, and they told us what they were doing with respect to international development and the role, especially of environmental concerns in relation to development. That first working group 3 years later became the International Development Ethics Association. As I returned to Costa Rica, convinced that if I was going to make a difference in international development, I had to learn the language. And I'm using English today, but many of you know how much I love using Spanish as well. So I want to talk today about how IDEA, beginning in 1984 and then the first conference in 1987, has grown and developed in different ways under different leadership over the years. And I'm very proud to look back over 37 years now, and something that we started in a little restaurant that no longer exists in Costa Rica and has become something that we, I think, can all be proud of. So what is development ethics, and what is it that we started, and how is it continued, and what shape does it have and should it have today? Well, one way to understand development ethics is ongoing moral reflection on the ends and means of development, understood now as beneficial social change. Development, of course, can also mean lots of things, like the development of a mall, or the development of a plaza, or the agricultural policies in a country. But we prefer to understand development in a broader sense as beneficial social change, which can occur on the local level, on a state level, on a national level, on a global level as well. And then increasingly, we've seen development as something that every country is involved in, including what we used to call developed countries, because every country has the responsibility to try to achieve good change and avoid bad change. what does development ethics do, whether it's done by academics or by practitioners? And it's important to have both. Well, we try to morally assess the present, the good and the bad and the ugly, but also the past and how we should deal with the past when it has been less than appropriate. We also try to envision a better future where people are responsible agents, where they're morally and politically equal, where they have real opportunities for well-being, where they live in a world that can be shared, not just with the present generation, but with the future generation. Individual and corporate responsible action is to be identified, and something that our moderator, Ana Malavisi, has been stressing over the years is that we need to continually raise the question of, are we making a difference? If not, how should we proceed in such a way that we can make a real difference in the world and help either build a better world or stop a worse world from emerging. When we began when I began teaching in the 70s and when IDEA began in the 80s, our primary concern at that point was the inadequacy of a value that for many people was central to development, and that is economic growth. It left out too many things. While growth is often important, it can be a problem, especially when it's not distributed appropriately or justly among those that it affects. We also found that at the beginning that development understood as economic growth was much too state-centric. It ignored what was going on the local level, but also on the global and regional level. It was also too much focused on third world needs and first world responsibilities without dealing with first world needs and third world responsibilities. It was too much top down. So as the 80s turned into the 90s, we began to shift with a focus on basic human needs, on capabilities that are valuable and have reason to be valued, on agency as an important part of development. And in the context of conflict now, it's a particular kind of conflict that we're engaged in, the conflict around COVID-19, the inequality of impact of appropriate vaccinations, appropriate treatments, as a crucial dimension. And I'm glad that we've already had a webinar on the justice of COVID-19 responses, but also the issue of climate change has become more and more important. And these are, as I'll show in a little bit, linked in important ways. One way that we began to think about development was also as an integrated process that involved not only economic issues, but also other issues. And we talked about 5 scourges or deep problems: poverty, degrading inequality, especially gender inequality, but not just gender inequality, environmental crises of various kinds, violence and conflict, and certainly the Medellin experience, not only in the 70s and 80s, but in the last few years since April of this year, with a lot of conflict and deaths that have occurred because of the conflict. And for me, especially the problem of tyranny locally, tyranny nationally, and tyranny globally as well. So the issue of democracy has emerged for many of us as an important issue, as a response, an ethically based response to the issue of tyranny. But now I think there are other scourges that are either sub-scourges or are newly impressed upon our awareness. Displacement, something that our colleague and former president of IDEA, Jay Drydeck, has been concerned with, and certainly an issue for Colombia right now, with the many Venezuelans that have come into the country, and as the United States right now is dealing with the Afghan exiles and immigrants. And the Costa Ricans are dealing with the issue of Nicaraguans. So displacement, pandemics and global health issues, the issue of corruption, and the issue of unfair discrimination. Those are additional scourges. And one thing in our contemporary approach to development ethics, we're aware of the interconnection of these different scourges and the importance of linking treatments of one aspect with treatments of other aspects. I want to just briefly mention that in our present context, there are many obstacles in the way of doing development ethics. And I'd like to just mention 4 of them, although there are other ones as well. The first obstacle for doing development ethics is that in our contemporary academic and political debate, there's an obsessive commitment to explaining and crystal balling, predicting. And often we don't get around to evaluating what we're trying to explain or evaluating what might happen. Pundits and policymakers focus almost exclusively on why something has happened or what is likely to happen instead of what should happen. And so the should questions, what should have happened in the past, what should happen in the future, get eclipsed by a concern with data and a concern with explanation. In our contemporary situation, there's a lot of, in the United States right now, there's a lot of concern about why did Manchin not support the, why does he support the filibuster? Or will he continue to support the filibuster? Rather than what are the moral merits and demerits of the filibuster, and should Manchin support it? Another obstacle to doing development ethics is that people that do development ethics are often seen as fools. They don't understand the way the world works. They don't understand that people are motivated as individuals or as groups by their own selfish concerns, and that anybody that thinks about doing the right thing is going to be taken advantage of by the rest, who are inordinately committed to their own well-being or that of their group. And it's true that ethics does require that we constrain our individual and group interest and balance them in relation to our obligations to other people and groups. Much of the debate in many countries today over whether one should wear a mask or not, and the argument often is you have to take care of yourself, yes, but you also have to be concerned with taking care of other people, both because in the long run that will enable you to take care of yourself and because it is right and proper in itself. A third obstacle for doing development ethics is what is often called political realism. That it's connected with the self-interest that we just talked about, but it's usually related to political realism in the sense that the only real thing that motivates people is their own interest, and political power and not ethics is what makes the world work. Now, there's something right about this. And here it's very important that we understand what does make things work, for example, or not work in Medellin. It's very important that we understand the facts as well as we can, but we also have to understand that just to identify a fact as important and not so important is itself an ethical evaluation. There's a danger of a crackpot realism that ends up supporting the status quo. But we need to find a balance between realism and idealism. And here I would urge those of you who, if you've not already become acquainted with her work, that of Samantha Power and her more recent memoir, The Education of an Idealist. She's important in relation to development ethics now because, as you know, she's now the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development. A final obstacle is really a set of obstacles, and that's the obstacle of bad ethics. Ethics can be done in bad ways as well as appropriate ways. And development ethics gets a bad name because of what passes as ethics in many contexts. For example, if an ethics is dogmatic, absolutist, presents itself as infallible, then that uncritical kind of ethics is what gives ethics a bad name as something that is very connected with authoritarianism. Ethics can also be too impractical, too abstract, too remote from the real world. And here is where the kind of challenge that Anna Malavasi has put to us over the years, we need to continually try to figure out ways in which the ethical concerns, ethical clarity, as Chloe Swenke would put it, can make a difference in the lives of practitioners, as well as practitioners can make a difference in the lives of those who spend more of their time in classrooms and writing articles. Also, ethics can get a bad name because it can be too top-down, too much a matter of pontificating from on high, not respecting the agency of those with whom one is speaking. It can also, ethicists can also be very hypocritical. They fail to practice what they advocate. And they can also use their ethics in order to camouflage, in order to hide things, to talk in glowing terms at the same time as engaging in behavior that is at odds with what they say. So development ethics today, I think, is seeking to overcome these obstacles, seeking to get moral clarity about not only ends and goals, but also means and how to get there. And I would argue for a just, sustainable, democratic concept of development that balances idealism and realism. I would argue for a comprehensive approach that sees these scourges that I talked about as interconnected and linked to each other, both as causes and effects, but also the ways of dealing with them, of mitigating them, of removing them. The dots have to be connected. Also, we need to overcome the conflict between a stress on the national level, on the global level, on the local level, regional level. These are all interconnected, and we may learn from one that can help with another. And right now, more and more people are recognizing that the kind of Bretton Woods structures that were developed in 1941 by Roosevelt and Churchill on a ship outside of the city, outside of the province of Newfoundland, that looking ahead, getting a big picture, and a few years later resulted in the Marshall Plan and the Bretton Woods institutions. We need to do that basic kind of rethinking today. We need, as the former USAID coordinator, Shah, has argued a basic new paradigm for development, that one that focuses on pandemics on the one hand and climate change on the other. And finally, we need a balance between what is universal, I would argue agency, well-being, sustainability, dignity, human rights, and what is particular to each society or each group within a society. So with that, we have development ethics in the context of crisis, in the context of conflict and violence, and in the context of a turn of many countries and many groups to an authoritarian answer to the pressing human problems. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you very much, David. That was wonderful. I couldn't help but think, you've sort of like identified the challenges ahead for us, I think, in such a way that sort of like, whoa, it can be overwhelming. But I think we need to think about those challenges. And I wanted to sort of also emphasize what you talked about with that development ethicists we're seen as fools. I think maybe we can put a more positive stance. We can consider ourselves as Socratic gadflies, right? Always there trying to sort of challenge and question and be sort of really niggling at the mainstream ideas and concepts put forward by in development. And but we do have lots of work ahead of us. And something else I just wanted to highlight too, what comes through from your presentation is the importance of not just thinking about development ethics as a theoretical study or a theoretical sort of area, but very much that bridging the practice. And I also wanted to sort of say that even though in our panel today we're overrepresented by philosophers or, if you like, academics, that's not really how we work as well. As development ethicists, we really do try to, sort of bridge and apply our work in the practice. And we do, and that's why I think the webinar the last webinar on Medellin was really important, because it also sort of made us think how important it is, what you said as well, the local context, the idiosyncrasies of the local culture, and the agents that are working there, and how we have to work together, right? So thank you very much, Dave. Now, there was one question posed to you, which I think we'll take it now and then go on to Luis. So the question, I'll read it out. So this is by Felipe Correa. He says, amazing story. Thank you very much for sharing. I would like to ask you if you considered any time that the concept of development also attached to the individual level, let's say moral development of the human being, or the old Eudemonian development at the individual level. Because the common notion of development is a political concept at the different levels. But I haven't read very much about this more psychological approach, and I'm wondering why. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is an important link between the capability approach to development on the individual level and the beneficial social change. And here I think the notion of agency can be very important contribution, in that we do need to talk about a flourishing life and what a flourishing life can and should be. And one aspect of a flourishing life, I think, for Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, is a person's being in charge of their own life, perhaps in and through dialogue with and working with other people, but not to be the pawn of somebody else's decisions and domination. So I think part of flourishing, although there are many other aspects of flourishing that can be available, I think that what we need is a sense of a good society in which it's a democratic society in the sense that the majority of people are able to exercise their freedom and their agency and their autonomy in and through institutions that they have been responsible for developing. There's many other aspects to flourishing that may be some of them culturally specific, but others may be more universal. And I think a developed society is one in which a developed human being is more able to flourish.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. And we have one more question and then we'll go on to Luis. So this is by Matthew Regan. He says, I wanted to ask about the universals for development ethics. How thick should these be? Are they more of a Rawlsian overlapping consensus or something thicker than that? Should we worry about conflicts at the edges or the core of these?
Good question. I think that they're thick enough to challenge us to promote them or protect them wherever they exist in the world, but thin enough that they challenge us to exercise them in ways that are appropriate to the local or regional context. I think Rawls gives us a good starting point for this, and the notion of reflective equilibrium has an advantage of connecting us with our deeply felt views that may come out of a given culture. But I think Rawls also leaves open, and maybe he should have done more, the idea of being able to transcend our cultural inheritance and evaluate it on the basis of what we learn from other parts of the world and the free reflection that people have in those parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to move on to Professor Luis Camacho. So Luis is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Costa Rica. Luis is also the president of the Costa Rica Philosophy Association and co-founder of IDEA, International Development Ethics Association. Luis is also on the board of the Center for Values and International Development, and he's made contributions in epistemology and philosophy of science. And has also been on the board of International Development Ethics Association too. So once again, we'll give Luis some time, and if you have any questions, please, participants, put them in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Good morning from Costa Rica.
Mm-hmm.
Today is Independence Day in Mexico and Central America, and we are celebrating the bicentennial, 200 years of independence in this part of the world, celebrated with the clouds of not only the political problems in several countries, but also the physical clouds of constant rain, almost like in Macondo. Thank you very much for the invitation to share some memories and opinions about development ethics and about the International Development Ethics Association. The topic or theme selected for the next IDEA conference, the challenges of conflict for development, seems to me especially appealing and very well chosen for our times and for our plights. Several variations of the topic of the theme come to mind: conflicts in development, the development of conflicts, because conflicts also develop, and development under conflicts, as well as development in spite of conflict. I'm sure an open discussion on all of these will be very productive and interesting. And I am looking forward to the meeting in Colombia, because we had 2 years ago the International Conference of the Inter-American Philosophy Association in Bogota. And it was such a good experience that I'm looking forward to going back to that wonderful country. The International Development Ethics Association, known by the acronym IDEA, pronounces in Spanish, was born at the University of Costa Rica, and David already mentioned the details. But this 1984 meeting took place in the context of a large international conference held in Costa Rica, sponsored by the government in the larger context of the Central American conflicts at the time, deeply immersed in the Cold War confrontation. And this was the occasion for the meeting of minds of two different groups, one local and the other international. Several streams of research converged in a way that has become very fruitful. Before the meeting convened to create an association devoted to development ethics, the field of development ethics was already in existence, both in Spanish and English and other languages. And there already were several pioneers work on the topic, in particular the book with such a title by the North American philosopher Denis Goulet, as well as his book, The Cruel Choice, published in 1971. Likewise, at that time, there already was in place a lively discussion among analytical philosophers in Costa Rica about the role of science and technology in socioeconomic development. The debate had begun at the National Philosophy Conference in 1974, devoted to the topic of development as economic improvement with social change. As far as we know, this was the first conference devoted to the topic of development among philosophers. And it was in 1974 when the proper task of philosophy in the discussion on development was clearly formulated. The proper task of philosophy in analyzing development is to create, to think at a notion of development which is in itself developed, the development of the notion of development, the creation of a richer, more profound, more satisfying notion of development. And it has become like the slogan or the mantra for all the following considerations. At the same time, science and technology became another topic for the philosophical reflection in the country, not only in the country, but also in many Latin American countries. The characteristics of technology, the lessons from the history of machines and techniques, and above all, the relation of science, technology, and development were topics about which several seminal papers and books were written, and a magazine was created. Years before the topic became popular among philosophers in other parts of the world. Remember all the contributions by Argentinian and Colombian philosophers about the relation between science, technology, and development, which has became like a very typical Latin American school of thought, similar to what happened in the United States and English-speaking countries with science, technology, and society. The STS, the famous STS approach in the universities. The Latin American equivalent is science and technology and development, not society, because we were concerned with poverty, and all the deprivation and all of these problems. So in 1984, at the conference David mentioned, in a panel with David and other philosophers from several countries, we were surprised to find a similar concern in people coming from different places, although their concern was centered more around ethical issues, and not so much about the possibilities offered by science and technology for the improvement of conditions in poverty-stricken countries. But we were missing the ethical, I think we were missing the ethical approach. After that meeting, we have the very long series of IDEA activities in many countries, as well as the personal participation of many of its members in projects aimed at social change all over the world. Today, the literature on development ethics and the collection of cases are both illuminating and very useful for the solution of problems. One of the very interesting facts about the long trajectory of development ethics is the convergence, the coincidence of three topics: development, human rights, and democracy. And I might go back to this idea at the end. I will speak probably in Spanish. Each one of them leads to similar results: a free democratic society where human beings are able to have meaningful and productive lives have to comply with human rights and aim at development. Today, we cannot conceive of human rights without democracy, and we cannot defend development without democracy and without human rights. Each one of these approaches lead us to similar conclusion and results. They are three ways to reach similar ends. But also, if they are missing, the results are negative in similar ways. Now, let me say something about development ethics. Development ethics deals with some aspects of economic improvement plus social change related to the fact that we as human beings are rational, free, and liable for our actions. As an ethical reflection, it deals with the typical subjects of good and bad, rights and duties, virtues and vices, right and wrong, justice and injustice. The initial statement from Denis Goulet in his work, The Cruel Choice, right at the beginning, is very clear. Quote, "For developed and underdeveloped societies alike, basic questions are neither economic, political, or technological, but moral. What is the good life and what is the good society in a world of mass technology and global interdependence? Is fullness of good incompatible with abundance of goods? Is human development something more than a systemic combination of modern bureaucracy, efficient technology, and productive economy?" Unquote. So we have so far two guiding principles. First of all, we need a developed notion of development. And second, the main problem in development is moral. The notion of development brought about by careful reflection has to include a clear statement of purposes and values in planned changes. One of the most interesting contributions in the debate was made right at the beginning. Economic growth, just distribution of goods and services, and the satisfaction of basic needs can be seen both as a means or as an end of development. It should be clear in theory and in practice what measures are proposed as a means for ends and what are the purposes of each measure. To strive for the satisfaction of basic needs as a means to improve the quality of life in the population is one thing. To propose the satisfaction of basic needs as an end in itself is another thing. The first approach seems to make more sense than the second. Development ethics is ethics, i.e., a discussion on good and evil, on preferences and values. And it has to be normative, since its aim must be the promotion of values considered better than their opposite. Democracy and human rights are at the core of this theory and practice. Development ethics should avoid the frequent trap among philosophers of avoiding commitments and norms by moving into a purely descriptive approach of values and preferences. An approach which is valid and very useful in sociology and anthropology, but which becomes a self-deception if adopted by philosophers as their only concern. Here we find a situation similar to the one in logic, and logic is one of my fields. Logic is normative and a priori. It has to do with valid and invalid arguments, whereas argumentation theory is more descriptive and a posteriori. Both are needed, but they are different. Finally, let me say something about conflict. Conflict is not a topic to which philosophers devote much time. If you look at the analytical indexes in books on development ethics and in general in philosophy, there is a very low probability that you will find an entry for conflict. More in general, conflict is one of those topics like risk, el riesgo in Spanish, das Risiko in German, which have knocked at the door of philosophy several times without being answered. Given the importance of all kinds of conflict, we urgently need a discussion on this subject. And here are a few ideas. First of all, we should distinguish between conflicts and aggression. Since very often, situations properly described as aggressions are termed conflicts. Every time we can identify a victim and a perpetrator, we should avoid using the term conflict to describe the situation, and rather we should talk about aggression. Between the bully and the school and his classmate victims, there is no conflict, but aggression. Between the settlers that take the land of the rightful owners and those deprived of their property, there is no conflict, but an act of aggression with aggressors and victims. Conflict is a symmetrical relations. If A is in conflict with B, B is in conflict with A. And there are many examples. Aggression is not a symmetrical relations. If A attacks B, B is the victim. The distinction between conflicts and aggression can also be seen in the proper reaction to them. We negotiate conflicts, but we denounce aggression. Where there is a conflict, it makes sense to promote dialogue between the parties, whereas such a dialogue is impossible when one of the parties is an aggressor. Secondly, we also need to distinguish between conflict and violence. Although conflicts frequently involve violence committed by both sides, not all conflicts imply violence. Some are objective inconsistencies and contradictions, which must be dealt with by different people in the best way, in the best possible way. For example, there is a conflict between health regulations aimed at preventing the propagation of a pandemic and the plight of people without income who need to go out of their homes in search of help. We might use another notion of violence to describe these situations in the way Aristotle considers violent everything contrary to the nature of human beings, like hunger and deprivation. With or without another name, the fact is that the way to deal with objective conflicts and the way to solve conflicts with high levels of subjectivity are not the same ways. Y ahora quisiera hablar algo en español, decir algo en español.
Now I'd like to say something in Spanish very briefly.
Louis, might be good if people who want to listen to you have it translated, they will need to press the English function. Is that right? If anyone
In-
needs the tech,
in,
yes.
in interpretation.
Yes. In the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen, just for those of you who want to hear it in English, please press the English. I think,
Sure.
yeah.
I will be very, very brief anyway.
Okay. Okay, go ahead, please.
El punto que quiero desarrollar en español
The
es
point I
que
want to develop in English is, as there's a convergence and a coincidence between democracy, human rights,
y desarrollo.
and development,
Los caminos del pensamiento
the paths of thought have converged now, so that when we talk about development, we have to talk about human rights and we have to talk about democracy. And unfortunately, also the opposite converges. When we don't have democracy, we don't have human rights. And also it's interesting, we don't have development either. So we have seen in the last years, unfortunately, maybe more in Latin America than in other places, the appearance of political regimes through democratic mechanisms that later turn out to destroy democracy. And generally, they get to power with the people's support, but then they divide those people and those who criticize them. All the rights are for those who follow, and no rights for those who are against that power. And as we said many years ago in Nicaragua, I have money for those who follow and violence for those who oppose and a stick for those who are indifferent. And this problem of the appearance of these regimes probably won't get solved very soon. I think it'll get worse, and for neighboring, this means problems for neighboring countries, and I think we have to keep this in mind in terms of the number of regimes that appear in our continent. In the case of Venezuela, for example, Mais Vallenilla, philosopher who founded the Venezuelan Association of Philosophy, who was also one of the members of the commission that created the new constitution of Venezuela after the arrival of Hugo Chavez. But then he pointed the problem of generating big divisions between the people, and there's no equal rights for everybody. I just wanted to point out this aspect. I wanted to do it in Spanish because it's closer to our reality of people who speak Spanish. So that would be all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. Yes, it's a bit of a somber sort of ending, but something that we need to think about. And I think the way that you also highlighted the connections and the tensions between democracy, human rights, and development is something that we need to take into account going forward. And also how maybe we as development ethicists, we haven't sort of really addressed the problem of conflict so much. I think about sort of Nigel Dow's work and his work on peace building and, sort of abolition of war, against war and things like that as sort of contributing to that. Anyway, we have a couple of questions before we go on to Eduardo. Chloe Schwenkis asks, Dave Crocker mentioned both the capability approach and Rawlsian ethics. You have mentioned the important work of Dennis Goulet and the wide emphasis on human rights. In your view, is international development ethics also doing enough to draw upon other well-established streams of ethics and philosophy, such as Kantian ethics, virtue ethics, ethics of care, utilitarianism, and others?
I am more familiar with Kantian ethics and also scholastic ethics than other traditions like utilitarianism. And I find Kantian and virtues and vices ethics, the scholastic approach, very useful. I mean, ethics has different origins. I mean, different schools of ethics sometimes do not necessarily oppose each other. Remember that sentence by Leibniz at the end of his life, when in a letter to his friend Raymond, Leibniz, G.W. Leibniz says, I am convinced that the difference between all these philosophical sects is much less than we think. Than when they, in what they defend, they are usually right. They are wrong in what they reject. So I find that Kantian ethics and scholastic ethics, the ones I'm more familiar with, are very useful. Sometimes very difficult to put them together, but they have wonderful insights about the human experience. Was that a question? I mean, is that the answer for the
Yes, no, I think that's good for now. Yes, it sort of may extend into sort of more into afterwards. There is a question here that I'm not really sure if this just finishes there. I think we'll move on to one more from Stacy. How might we best address authoritarian leaders or tendencies, even within our own societies, in a way that they might hear and not dismiss us? Or is that not possible?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that. No, we are called today upon very extraordinary measures to oppose the tyranny. Probably even personal sacrifices, or I mean, to face the evil, because we are realizing that evil can be more evil than we thought possible before, and we need very special, I mean, solidarity among peoples, better organization, stronger ties between all the people who all the people who oppose oppression. All of that is needed, but unfortunately I don't have a simple recipe for as the solution for the situation.
Thanks very much, Luis. So I think we'll move on now to Eduardo Reda. So let me present Eduardo. Eduardo Reda is a philosopher. He's also a medical doctor. He's a university professor at the National University in Colombia and executive director of Red Etica, which is the network for ethics and citizenship education. He's okay, and also the former head of the political philosophy group at Claxo. So Eduardo's work focuses on bioethics, moral and political philosophy, and ethics education. And Eduardo will be speaking in Spanish. So those people who want to listen to it in English, please press your button. Thank you. Go ahead, Eduardo.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Ana.
Thank you very much, Ana. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by this last topic that Professor Luis talked about in his presentation, which is the topic of conflict, and to see how development, at least from a Latin American perspective, is linked to the conflict that we are going through very strongly, as we have seen in the media. And against that, with that backdrop, I would like to explain what the task of development ethics would be by thinking of it from the social movements and the civil society, what they think and propose about development and the principles that are linked to those mobilizations, social mobilizations. First, let's say that social conflict has, in principle, a normative content, which can be seen through authors such as the ones that appear in the slides. You can think that effectively in social conflicts, people mobilizes because they think that their dignity is profoundly affected, and that we see in Latin America today. That's the description that, for instance, Habermas would offer. But you can also recognize the social conflicts today, especially in Latin America, are expressions of rejection to a historical experience of rejection for many social groups. That would be a descriptions that you can find in authors like Axel Honneth, and you can see that this point is very important, that the social mobilizations are expressed against.
Sorry for the noise. Perdón por el ruido de los perritos.
Sorry for the noise of the dogs. I was saying that you can see that social mobilizations occurs because measures are taken that social agents or citizens don't find justifiable. So in social mobilization in the streets, and that has been seen in the media in Latin America, and that has been in the hearts of the families, you can see these elements, these normative elements implicitly. People react because they see their dignity affected, because the practices that define the authority of the state make more profound the historical rejection, or people just react because they think that the measures are arbitrary. Those are the problems that are catalysts for social reactions, not only in Colombia, but as we have seen in all the region, and especially now after the pandemic. But before the pandemic, we also had this. There are mobilizations against measures that have been taken in relation with taxes because citizens think they are unfair. Recently in Colombia, as we all know, um, citizens reacted because the decision was made by the government to present a fiscal reform that was against the rights of people, and there was a serious economic damage because of the pandemic. There are social expressions that are aimed at claiming for a basic income because people don't have a basic income that allow them to live with dignity. Rose talked about that in the theory of justice. There are social reactions because of the way that minerals are being extracted from the soil, affecting people in the regions, in the rural areas, and also other people are mobilizing because of that. There are mobilizations related with the ownership of land that in our countries are terribly concentrated. Also because of people don't have medical care, many things that we all know. And people also react because people experience not having enough democratic inclusion. For instance, the victims of armed conflict in Colombia in relationship with the name of the conference that we are having next year, Development in Times of Conflict, is an issue for the victims of violence. There is no democratic inclusion of indigenous people or migrants, just to mention a few issues. These social conflicts also have a history. They are not emerging now as a result of the pandemic, but they are also explained in the history of development in Latin America, understood as the systemic organization and legitimizing organization of the so-called social progress. There have been some ways of thinking about that economic progress that have been settled in our society with an institutional apparatus, a political and symbolical apparatus, which has some agents. And anyway, it has been in the base of all these conflicts. This history, I cannot tell it in detail, but I wanted to show in this slide the models that have been most prominent along this history. The exports, the model of exporting commodities, or the industrializing model that failed. Latin America could never be industrialized effectively. Latin America could not reach stability in terms of industry. And we also have the neoliberal model, which is the current model, which we all know, which is characterized by privatization, foreign investment, exports, work precarization, all that we all know very well. And this model has not been able to overcome the problems that justify this social mobilization that I mentioned. No, none of these models has been able to articulate a series of practices that make that people experience a more dignified life, and therefore people feels affectations to their dignity, and therefore they react and they go out to the streets and protest. But they are in the base of this. We have these models that have failed in the task to establish for all a collective and shared way of life that they can consider as fair. What happens when we see the neoliberal development, which has covered our last 30 years in Latin America? You can see how effectively inequality has grown. I can share this presentation later, but here you can see how inequality in Latin America has grown because there are a series of problems related to access and enjoyment of the rights of children, for instance, to education, or problems related with nutrition, the percentage of malnutrition in Latin America is too high, and medical care has a low coverage. And this is just a sample of how, in the socioeconomic aspect, the neoliberal model is translated. And if we see the environment, there are very serious problems in Latin America. 9 of the 24 fronts of deforestation in the world are located in Latin America. These small circles that you see on the top right map in your screen, which was developed by a European group, shows the places in Latin America. This is a photograph of Latin America, the places where there are social conflicts as a consequence of intervention proposals or environmental exploitation that people reject because it damages their rights. The black dots have to do with carbon and so on. We also have problems of pollution in the cities. Latin America has some of the most polluted cities in the world. And we see how
un crecimiento en las pérdidas de biodiversidad, en la afectación a la autonomía.
biodiversity has been diminished. Many ethnic territories have been threatened because there are a series of extractive entrepreneurships that are based in procedures apparently are apparently legitimate.
Y con ello mantengan entonces la posibilidad de acceder efectivamente a sus derechos. Y todas estas son consecuencias del modelo de
These are
desarrollo.
consequences of the development model.
Igual son consecuencias del modelo de desarrollo.
These are consequences of the development model, the growing lack of solidarity among the population. From the hedonistic individualism that Habermas presents in his works until the idea of self-exploitation or the lack or the idea of lack of solidarity by Nussbaum. Those are consequences of the neoliberal model, which makes people to have less willingness to solidarity that will favor individualism that generates democratic impoverishment and that makes it easy for private agents to undertake the state and it promotes fear and stigmatization of some groups as it has happened in the United States, as you all know. That it's unbelievable what has happened in the United States and in Brazil. These authoritarian leaderships, which are very concerning and that have been forged on fear and on stigmatization of some groups as guilty of the lack of opportunities of some other groups. This has been a product of a result of this neoliberal model. And it is against these kind of issues that development ethics is justified. This appears not only from the theoretical elaboration that we philosophers can make, but that would come from the social movements. They have ethical and political ideas that you as a philosopher can separate them and put them on the table. And those are some principles which are the base of social movements. For instance, the social and environmental sustainability principle.
Licencia minera que quería conceder el Estado a la compañía Global Chanti para explotar oro en un páramo que es un santuario de agua. Y entonces en ese santuario de agua,
in that sanctuary, they said, here you cannot touch our water. This is the water of our sons, not only today's generations, but also the future. There is a social environmental sustainability principle, and this is not in the philosopher's books. This is on the streets.
Bauman,
and as Bauman would say, these are the new ways of transforming community that is fundamental for philosophers to recognize. An agenda of redistribution. Maybe you remember Nancy Fraser. You can see an agenda of democratic inclusion and you think philosophers think about the political reasons or radical inclusion in Habermas, what you like. You can see in the agendas of the social movements the defense of the ethnic groups and the territories, and that has to do with subjects that have dealt with some philosophers like Aníbal Quijano, etc. You see people fighting in the streets, the invocation to these principles of integrity and accountability, because there is corruption all over and people protest and they invoke these principles and they give a public sense to these terms.
Que ser el respeto a las mujeres, la equidad de
Talk
género.
about gender equality, equality for women in fair institutions that allow peace, stabilization, and citizen solidarity. And this happens in the streets. And this is fundamental for development ethics because this has to do with people and what moves people to go to the street, because fundamentally people react with these unfair situations that are perceived by people. And we see this in infrastructure plans, in cartography of conflict in Latin America. You can see this. We have different conflicts in which the catalyzer is related to infrastructure plans, the use of energy. Now we have a problem in Colombia with a dam that was made and has been object of corruption, has generated environmental damage, and also sanitation policy, tax policy, public budgets. All of this has been evaluated by people that then go to the street, and then you could understand development ethics not only in a constructive manner that is related to evaluation of societies, but we could also understand it as a reconstructive, in a reconstructive manner, as a theoretical effort to identify those principles that are related to social practice and to track the scope of those principles in the ways of balancing those principles in situations in which those actors collide. And also within those principles, when we think about social and environmental sustainability, we have different ideas. When we think about autonomy, farmers' autonomy, we have different ideas that they all defend ethical autonomy, but these type of nuances are part of scrutiny by philosophers, and conceptual scrutiny that has the role of accompanying the social praxis as it offers social agents a base through which they can understand their own project and through which they can present a political agenda. So that would be all. Thank you so much, Anna. That'll be it. I hope I didn't speak too fast.
I think, oh, I know. I think people sort of, I understood it in Spanish, so I think people would have understood it in English with the translation, I hope. So we're sort of running a bit out of time. But thank you very much, Eduardo. That was very, that was very interesting. And I think how you really developed the importance of understanding the history of the concept of development and what that has meant and the implications it has was very good. There are two questions posed by Des and Nigel that are for all of you. So I'm going to read Des's first. The forthcoming Medellin Conference of IDEA is entitled Development in Times of Conflict. Lewis suggested that development ethics has not given great attention to conflict. Could the panelists please give their thoughts on some of the issues and possible responses that they suggest we should think about for and in the conference? So anyone's, can answer this.
Sí, can I answer in English? Or what do you think? In English.
Eduardo, if you, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I try to explain in my intervention, in my talk, that the conflict that we have what we have to see, the main conflict that we have to see during our conference next year is the social conflict. I mean, what is more important right now to address, considering the situation that we are living in Latin America, are this kind of this sort of social conflict in which there are normative demands, as I have explained during my talk, in the sense that people really consider that many measures, that many decisions, that many positions of different agents are regarding for them unfair, that are unfair or are not ethically as acceptable. Yeah, just for say something. Yeah, but I think that it would be the core of the considerations during our conference.
Yes, thank you, Eduardo. Go ahead, Luis, and then Dave may want to say something.
It seems to me that the main challenge is for philosophers and for almost everybody is to propose solutions to particular conflicts. There are so many different kinds of conflicts that probably the solutions are also very, very different. The conditions in Colombia right now are not exactly the same as in Costa Rica, but we have also problems like unemployment. And we need to find solutions to that. In addition to that, a theory of conflicts might be also useful. And I'm if you look for a general theory of conflicts among philosophers, you will not find one.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people have written on a theory of conflicts from a philosophical perspective. I might think of probably Galtung, the Norwegian philosopher. But very few people. So it seems to me that we need a general theory of conflicts from philosophical perspective, the same way we have a more robust approach to things like technology or science among philosophers, which people have thought about that for years and years and years, and the literature is very, very thick. So in summary, we need to propose solutions to particular conflicts.
Yeah, I agree with Luis that we really have to point out, to focus on solutions. But on the other hand, I think that within the philosophical tradition, we have very interesting approaches to conflict, social conflict at least. And I'm thinking especially in the School of Frankfurt, in the critical theory of society, which has tried to, in the beginning, of course, to follow the idea of social change posed by Marx. And so within the critical theory of society framework, we can see a very interesting approach about what is and what we should overcome social contradictions and social conflicts. I also think that, for example, in American philosophers like Richard Rorty, for example, in pragmatism or so, or in philosophers like Michael Walzer, the topic of social conflict is at the core of their own ways of drawing the idea of justice. Yeah, but it is my impression. Yeah, of course. Excuse me, Anna.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Thanks. Dave, did you want to say anything in response to that one?
Well, I think the topic of conflict and its relation to violence that Luis brought up was very interesting. I think we tend to merge those topics together. My own concern with the topic of conflict has emerged in relation to that kind of democratic decision-making that's often called deliberative democracy, in which deliberation may be a way of overcoming some kinds of conflict and living with or even accepting and endorsing other kinds of conflict. And it may be that all of these are symmetrical in the sense that Luis was differentiating violence where one person is dominating the other. But what kind of disagreements, tensions, conflicts are managed, minimized, and sometimes accentuated by the rough and tumble of give and take that occurs within genuine dialogue. I think that whole area needs to be explored more. And it may be that one of the roles of the Medellin conference would be to try to apply a theory of conflict to the different kinds of conflict that emerge in democratic decision-making of various kinds, in contrast to non-democratic decision-making.
Thanks so much, Dave. Yes, I think this is very interesting, and just wanted to sort of mention that in Stephen Esquith, who also works in peace and reconciliation, has written something in the chat box, but also he and his colleagues are organizing the next webinar, which will be on Mali, peace and reconciliation. So I think their webinar will also give some insights into working with sort of conflict as well. So that's something to think about, and I think we've all got something to think about for the conference. But I just want to we'll finish with one last question by Nigel Dower, and he writes, and as mentioned, I'm interested in the connection between good, in parentheses, development and peace building, peace beyond mere cessation of armed conflict. Both are beneficial social change. Both depend on greater justice and recognition of human rights, proper voice and participation, etc. Bad models of development are likewise linked to violence and negative conflict. How do the panelists respond to this suggestion?
I completely agree. After living in a country that has been in a continuous war during 50 years or something, yeah, we can conclude what Nigel presents in the chat. Yeah, we can conclude that there is not possible to stabilize peace without conquering some kind of development that really recognize human rights, give them proper voice, and strength proper democratic participation of people, and so on. So I agree.
Thank you, Eduardo. Luis, Dave, would you like to add anything?
Well, yeah, yes. I was thinking about my country. 200 years with political stability.
Mhm.
This is a country which is not rich by any stretch of the imagination, which has had the last arm, the last interruption of the continuity of constitutional governments in 1948. Now, I find the case, the Costa Rican case, very interesting, and if I may sound chauvinistic, please, I apologize, but I think that among all the problems in the world, to find a country with 200 years of political stability is very remarkable. And of course, I agree with Nayo about the relation between peace building and development.
Luis, I think what you sort of highlight is that it can be done, right?
Sure.
That it's possible.
Yeah, it
gives
can
us
be
some
done.
hope.
Yeah.
Right.
And yet I'd like to just interject that complacency is really something to be challenged here, because all of a sudden January 6th erupted in our North American experience to recognize the kind of bad conflict or violent conflict, and that democracy is very fragile, and it needs to be. We need to be vigilant about it and scrutinize it all the time, because there's all ways in which very slowly and sometimes silently and invisibly, what started out to be a nonviolent conflict mitigating decision-making approach can turn into something terrible.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree.
Of course.
For sure.
Yeah. Thank you to all of you. Now, I just wanted to open the floor to sort of anyone that actually you can, maybe, I think people can have access to the mics, right? Can they, if they wanted to speak? I don't know if anyone has a last question. Yes, please do sort of unmute yourself if you can. If you're not, yes, maybe we can just, or put it in, if any last questions in the chat box, if we can't unmute yourself. But you've all three of you have given lots of food for thought. Rukuku from Uganda is with us too, which is great. And he, says that conflict, in some cases, the situation gets more complicated, especially under a dictatorship. Yes, we're sort of, that just goes to show how important democracy is, right? But as you said, Dave, we can't be complacent about even sort of democracy, right? So if anybody has any more questions, please, or you can follow up with any of the speakers. I think I'm not too sure whether email addresses, I haven't put them in, but I'm sure you can locate them. But thank you all very much for attending. It's been a wonderful webinar. And the next webinar will be, as I mentioned before, will be by Steve Esquith and his colleagues from Mali on peace and reconciliation. So that would be an interesting one as well. And there'll be further webinars next year. I think there's another one being organized on epistemic justice. And there may be another one on the Medellin context before the actual conference. And as I said at the beginning of the webinar, we are still fine tuning the relaunching of the call for papers. So it'll be on the website. And this website, this recording will also be available on the website if you're interested to forward it on or to watch it again. Anyone have any further things to say? Anyone anything from the presenters?
No, thank you very much for all my colleagues and for you, Anna. And thank you for the audience for being here with us, for the questions and so on.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for facilitating this interchange and being a good gatekeeper.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you. Yes.
It's a pleasure to see everybody.
Yeah, it's a pity we can't see everybody, but we sort of hear them, sort of,
Sure.
right? Or read them anyway. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's lovely to see all these people from IDEA. Yes, let's hope we can see each other in Colombia next year. It's great to see you all and hear of you. So till next time, it's bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.